So in the second chapter, that is a chapter on differentiation of self, all this conversation that we had in the first chapter around chronic anxiety and the ways that gets expressed, then there's a very natural segue to, so okay, that's what's so. Families, I mean, small groups of people, unit, family is the group is the organizing definer of who we are and how we are in the presence of anxiety, and all of that is the way that gets expressed. So what do you? That's just what is. I mean, is that are we victim to that? What do you do about that? The second chapter addresses that.
Yeah. So there's a concept that comes out in chapter 1 that's unpacked in chapter 2, and that's the concept of fusion.
Yeah, so and that happens in the, well, actually the chapter is about the differentiation of self.
True, that's the title.
So that's the title, and actually, I think what we would want to communicate, what I would want to communicate, let me speak for me, is that in the mix of all of that chronic anxiety, the way out of that is the way of learning to define yourself.
Yes.
Or said a different way, learning to become more self-differentiated. Or said another way that actually you taught me that I think is the most powerful way to say it, is becoming more emotionally mature.
Yeah, I like that language.
Yeah.
But even the self-differentiation language works for me. You know, sometimes as Christians we get uncomfortable with anything that has the word self in front of it. But again, going back to nature, going back to how we were created, God clearly has given each one of us a unique self.
Right.
And that He intended for us to have. He gives each individual our own skin. We are separate from each other. We can't read each other's minds, although we're influenced by each other. We are each separate selves, and I think that's part of the design.
And so what we're doing is we want to distinguish being selfish
from
being fully who you were designed to be,
exactly.
which in this language is defining a self, defining my unique identity, giftedness, passions, calling. That's what we mean differentiation
being
of self.
the self God created you to be.
Right.
Yes.
And so I don't want to lose this. We live in these chronic anxious systems, and what we're going to talk about in this segment of the video is what it looks like to define a self, what it looks like to become more emotionally mature, what it looks like not to be victim to all of that chronic anxiety. And there's several things that we want to say about that. And one of the ways that it shows up is where you wanted to go a minute ago, where when we're just victim to that chronic anxiety, refused.
Yeah, it's when things start getting stuck together.
Yeah, right.
And
so how would you define fusion, or what would you say to
being stuck together?
And so how is being stuck together? You were just saying
a while ago, internally things get stuck together. Our thinking and our feeling get stuck together.
Yeah, well, I think there are two kinds of fusion that the literature talks about, and one's an internal fusion where I can't distinguish between my thinking and my feeling.
Yeah.
And
they're so glommed together.
Right. So you ask me how are you feeling right now, and I say, well, I'm just I just think that's wrong.
Right. And you use the thinking word to describe a feeling.
Right. And I think the downfall of that is that often we get led by our feelings rather than led by our thinking. So we just do what feels good, what feels easy, what feels natural, and so our thinking and our feelings get so fused that we can't distinguish what we really believe and who we really want to be.
I mean, the way that I experience it is that when I'm really anxious, the feelings just lead.
They do.
And what I've come to recognize is that as long as they're, as you say, glommed together, then I'm going to do whatever my feelings tell me to. And what my feelings tell me to do is protect myself. It tells me to, I mean, they don't even tell me. I just instinctively react the way that I learned to react out of my wounding.
Right.
And so part of what I've learned is, and this is, by the way, almost always in the early stages after the fact. I'm rarely well defined in a moment of anxiety. But
if the anxiety is high enough.
If the anxiety is high enough. But the way I've gotten better at that is after the fact, I've sat down and I've actually done the hard work of saying, so this is what I felt, but this is what I think. And let me be real practical about that. So Ken and I have a conversation, and he does something that just pushes my buttons, and I'm angry, and I come out of that meeting, and I come to you, or I go to Betty, or I go to somebody, and I'm blah, 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 and I vent all of that stuff, and so the feeling stuff goes down, and I can say, I felt angry, I felt dismissed, I felt not listened to, I felt not respected. But because I've separated those out, then I have the capacity to say, so what do I think?
Mhm.
What kind of person do I want to be when I feel dismissed?
Yeah.
What would it look like for me to go back and have a conversation with Ken where I said what I needed to say? Well, as long as all that's all mixed together, I can't have that conversation. I can't have that thinking process. But when I can begin to separate those two, I still have to find courage to go do the right thing. But in our book, The Leader's Journey, we talk about the difference in knowing the right thing and having the capacity to do the right thing.
Right.
So separating feeling and thinking actually increases my capacity to know what the right thing is.
Yeah, a couple of things about that. One thing is when we get calmer and our feelings start to feel better, a lot of times we stop there. We
Right.
don't actually
'Cause I
start
just feel
taking
better.
on, so
Right.
what do I think about this? What do I notice about this? What kind of curiosity do I have about what just happened? And who do I want to be, which is the defining
Right.
question in the middle of this. We just stop.
Say that again,
I feel
please.
better. So,
Yeah, repeat that. I think
Defining
that's-
ourselves, saying
Yes.
who we want to be in that particular moment.
yes, and in my view, that's a big part of that. I'll say more about that in a minute. I want to be clear about the opposite of that as well.
Mhm.
So you're aware in that moment that you're very angry and you feel disrespected and there are all these feelings and maybe you express all those feelings, maybe to Ken, maybe not. But the opposite is also true. Some people, the way they learn to be in their family is to shut down
Right.
those feelings, to not allow themselves to feel the feelings. We often see this in marriages where one person is extremely emotionally expressive and the other person will say, I'm not driven by my feelings, but that person is just as driven by not expressing feeling as this person is by expressing
Both of them
feeling.
are expressions of anxiety.
Both of them are anxious.
And what we tend to do in the church is we tend to value the distancer.
Exactly.
He's so mature, he's so calm in the midst of all of that. And the expressive one, the one who does what I do and waves their hands, gestures and talks loud. That guy's the bad guy. But actually, in terms
They are
of
both anxious.
and both contribute equally to both of them are expressions of not thinking clearly and then living into your values.
They're both reactive.
Right.
Both are
Yeah.
doing the reactive thing they
Right.
learned
Yeah.
to do.
And then because I'm a good Christian person and I don't want to be mean and ugly, I take on your anxiety.
Mhm.
You've become anxious, and so now I'm anxious because you're anxious. And I get that knot in my gut again because you're anxious. And all I want to do then is to get rid of the knot in my gut. And so I give in to you. I give up some of myself
Right.
to you in order to get along, which is the other kind of fusion.
Which is the other kind of fusion,
Yeah.
when we're fused with other people.
So one kind of fusion is
Belong
internal,
together.
thinking, feeling, and then the other is I'm not okay if you're not okay.
Right, interpersonal.
Right.
Or I'm not okay if you don't agree with me. Or
Right,
I'm not
right.
okay if,
I can remember in the early years of our marriage, Betty and I like really different kinds of vacations. She wants to go to a city and get on a tour bus and spend all day, every day, learning interesting facts about the city. And for me, the idea of a vacation is a book, and it can be a mountain resort, it can be a beach, it can be a hotel room, but it's quiet and early on, those were just miserable experiences because we couldn't be okay unless we both wanted the same thing. Well, I'm the conflictor in our marriage, and Betty is the distancer, and so early on, what she'd do is she'd just give in and do what I wanted to do because that was the only way that we could be okay.
yeah, right.
Over time, what's happened is we've grown and matured and have learned how to both express ourselves. She's learned to say, that's just not very fun for me. And that made me really anxious, because that meant that we weren't going to have the vacation that I wanted. And over time, what we've learned, and so, this is just one expression of it. It may seem silly, but it's the way we've been both defined with each other and yet connected, is we'll go on a 2 or 3 day vacation, and I might spend the whole first day by myself reading, and she'll go get on a tour bus by herself, and she'll come back the second day and she'll say, so I saw 9 places yesterday, and these 3, I know you and you're going to love these. Would you go do these 3 with me? And so so that's become a way for us, of both of us getting what we need, saying what we want, and getting what we need, and also vacations not being about us doing 2 separate things, but staying connected.
Right.
And so I want to put out there that's a second definition
Right.
I want to add about what it means to be emotionally mature or to be self-differentiated is the capacity to say, to define myself and at the same time to allow you to define yourself.
Right.
To be able to say, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to do, and to take full responsibility for that. And at the same time, let you say what you think and feel what you feel and want what you want and do what you're going to do.
When you first, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to talk about the, I've lost my train of thought now.
So while you're trying to capture it,
Yeah.
what Tricia just said feels overwhelmingly complex when you first hear it.
Yeah.
If you're fused or if you're emotionally immature, really the only two options seem like we do what I want or we do what you want.
Right.
And to think that there is a third way where we can both get what we want and we can also be connected to one another, at first just sounds so overwhelmingly complex that people don't believe it's possible.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that it sounds like, Jim, is it sounds selfish.
Yeah.
And so we often get pushback and say, well, that just means you just do what you want. And I think the distinction is that I have the ability, for example, you use the example of your wife, I'll use the example of my wife. I give in to her, I do what she wants because of two reasons. One is because I choose to, because I love her, because I want to be a loving person, because that's out of my individuality.
Right.
That's out of who I am, and I do that as a choice. The other is because I don't want her to get angry at me.
Right.
I don't want her to be disappointed. I don't want her to be irritated. I don't want her to get anxious. And so out of that, I give in to her, and I give up part of myself just to reduce the anxiety.
And
that's fusion.
externally those look exactly alike. You engage
Right.
in the same behavior,
Right, exactly.
but internally one is a calm choice and the other is a reactive.
Right, and one results in, for example, my wife loves to shop, and I hate to shop. Okay, so out of fusion, I used to go shop with my wife, and about an hour into the shopping experience, both of us were miserable.
Right.
Because I was mad that I was
I got
there, I was there, blah, 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 and she was irritated because I was irritated, and we'd both come home and neither one of us had a good time. I can go with her shopping now. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But when I do, it's a choice that I make to be with her, to be a part of her life, and to express love to her.
It comes out of your values.
It comes out of my values, and so I don't carry all the emotional baggage with me when I go.
So when Becky says, so Ken, would you go shopping with me?
Right.
You have a choice at that moment to ask the question, what do I have to do to keep Becky from being mad?
Right.
Or you can ask the question, who do I want to be at this moment?
Right.
And that's the difference
Right.
between a certain kind of fusion and emotional immaturity and
Right.
emotional maturity that looks like self-differentiation.
And sometimes I can choose to stay home.
And sometimes you can choose
And
to stay home.
she can allow me to stay home. So we've created boundaries, which
Yeah.
is another conversation.
Absolutely.
Well, so one of the things that in the same way that in that first conversation we we talked about how anxiety is always present, chronic anxiety kind of drives our behavior. In this chapter, one of the really powerful ideas for me is the idea that in who we are, we're created in the image of God, and there's two forces that are like life forces that are at work in us, and one of them is the individuality force. And one of them is the togetherness force. And I want to see if I can just say out loud what I've come to understand about that. The togetherness force is really easy to understand. In the garden, it said it's not good for man to be alone. In the new, and so that happens in the New Testament. It talks about though we're all parts, we're part of a body, and we really find our definition in that larger body. And so there's this move for us to connect and to combine resources and forces and to find meaning and to make an impact in the world. The individuality force, I think the church hadn't valued that quite so much. Edwin Friedman, who's another one of the writers in this field, has really helped me with this. When what he does is he takes the human body, and he talks about how in the human body, when cells are first formed, all cells look exactly alike. But as the embryo develops, what happens is cells begin to take on very unique identity. And so a brain cell and a kidney cell have some things in common, but there are some things that are absolutely distinctive about the two of them. And though they'll interact and have lots of collaborative experiences that produce our experience of life, the kidney cell never comes to the brain cell and says, I think I'm going to become like the brain cell. They each have this really clear sense of individuality. And I think that's actually a God-given deal. In the New Testament, it says, there are many parts, and then there's the whole. And what we want to do is we either want to do the part or the whole, but finding the tension between these two life forces that make me want to define my unique self, my unique contribution. The way I've learned to say it, here's what I think, here's what I believe, here's what I want, here's what I need, here's what I see. That's a way of me acting out of the individuality force. And then what you were describing a minute ago is when I choose to hook up with Betty, or when I choose to hook up with Harbor Church, or with Mission Houston, or with Faithwalking, anywhere that I'm together with some people, when I make the best contribution to that togetherness when I'm choosing to bring my best self and choosing to cooperate and to collaborate and to connect.
Yeah, because the moment everybody gets fused and glommed together, at that moment we're not doing that. We're not maintaining our own unique identity, that unique God-given identity as a brain cell or a kidney cell or whatever. And now we are undifferentiated, and no physical organism can survive that way.
It's like if all the cells in our body all of a sudden became, liver cells.
Right. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And so for it to work, you've got to do both. You've got to have a body, but you've got to have the individual parts. And so for me, I want to say it again, in the same way that this chronic anxiety is like gravity, it just is. Well, the togetherness and the individuality forces are also like gravity. They're just created into our design, and a part of our learning is learning how to be individual and also be together.
Yes.
And
that is by definition what it means to be differentiated.
And my understanding of that, Jim, is we can grow and be 100% in both of those categories at the same time. One of the things that I probably was a mistake I made as I first began to read this material, and I think where a lot of people go is they think, well, there's a balancing point somewhere between individuality
50% of this and 50% of that.
Yeah, and it's not that. And you guys taught me when we first began to think systems that it's loops. And so there's individuality that feeds into my togetherness, that feeds into my individuality, that feeds into my togetherness. And so I can be completely who I am while at the same time being completely connected to a group of people.
Yeah.
And that would be the third definition, I think, of emotional maturity or self-differentiation, is the capacity to stay connected to other people in healthy ways without having my feelings and my behaviors determined by them.
Yeah.
And that's that both at the same time.
Right.
Because what happens, based on the family I grew up in, is that I either want to disconnect, right, because staying connected is making me anxious,
Right.
or if I'm going to stay connected, I'm going to do that by either dominating you and making you
Right.
give up self to me, or I'm going to do that by giving up self to you.
Right.
And we're saying that's not an emotionally mature or differentiated
Right.
response.
Yeah, it's really easy to be a calm self when you're disconnected. And it's really easy to be connected without being a real self. Where the challenge and the growth, and I want to keep saying, where I found so much power in this stuff is that, where the power in this stuff was it holds up a picture for me of what's possible.
Yeah.
And so, even, I guess I was, I was 47 or 48, 49 years old when we first started working on the book, on the Leader's Journey. And I look at where my life was at that point. I'm pastor of a church. I'm the leader of a large denominational organization. And what I recognized was that two things happened to me pretty quickly. One was that I realized that I was pretty emotionally immature. And I was one of the leaders.
Which is very disappointing. I say that to folks all the time. We all assume because we're in positions of leadership that, well, my emotional maturity is, very, and then we realize when we begin to study this and realize we get disappointed at the level that it's at. because it's not nearly as high as we think it is.
Exactly, exactly. But the other thing that it did for me then was it gave me something other than, so pray more, read your Bible more. You know,
Right.
I was doing that on a daily basis with a lot of intensity, and what this did was it gave me a different way of thinking about what I needed to do. Just learning to ask the question, so as a unique self, what do I see? What do I want? What do I think? What do I value? What do I need? And asking those in a thoughtful way, that was just a whole different way of being for me.
Right.
And there was, I mean, I don't want to be mystical about this, but there was something about slowing the pace of my life down, getting the feeling stuff calmed down so that I could do that kind of thinking. And it was in those moments that it felt like the Spirit had the most room to work in me. It was where courage got generated, you know, when I could begin to see. So I've had all this stirred upness going on, but when I get calmed down, I can see that this is what I think is right. This is what the kind of person I want to be. This is what I think we need to do. Courage could never come until I could get that kind of clarity. And so just the tools of individuality and togetherness, or fusion and differentiation, or all of that just gave me a frame to think about changing my own behavior in a way that I had never been challenged with before.
Right. For me, Jim, one of the applications also, you guys both know my story, and I pastored Cornerstone Baptist Church for 13 and a half years and eventually left, and when I left, I was burnt out. And I thought I knew why until I began to study this material and recognized that one of the leading things is that I was fused. And I wasn't differentiated, and I was taking on responsibility for people rather than simply having responsibility to them, to be their pastor. And so I took on their anxiety, I took on all of their vibration, and I had no skills and it wasn't even in my toolbox at that time to know this language or how to do these things. And as a result of it, it just burned me out in doing good stuff, doing good ministry. Which is another just way of saying how powerful this is as a set of tools.
So, as we move toward finishing this deal, I wonder, so you're a therapist and you're a coach, people come to you and they say, I recognize that I need to increase my level of emotional maturity, or that I need to define myself while staying connected. What are some
Well, first
ways?
of all, people never say
Exactly. They don't know that that's what they need to do.
Yeah. Well, if they say some version of that leads you to introduce them to this language, what are some strategies? I mean, if there are people listening to this video and whatever level of emotional maturity they're at, they take on, I want to become more emotionally mature. What are some strategies that this
I think what we've done so far is we've said, first of all, you have to be able to see it. Once you can see it, you can see the anxiety, you can see your own patterned reaction. That's half the battle. That's not a cliche. That really is half of it right there. It makes everything else possible. Then you have to be able to name it, and you have to be able to, I have to be able to name it with you, if possible. To be able to say to you, you know, I feel like I'm really being drawn into over-functioning with you right now. I'm going to pull back from that, or at least to be able to say that to myself. To say, this feels like a triangle. I'm going to step out of this. And then to be willing and able to choose something different. And then that's the part I think you're really asking about that. But those first two things have to happen first. We can't go straight to the doing.
So
but
you see it, and
you
then
see
you
it
say
and you name it. Yeah, you say it. And then to be willing to say, rather than doing what I learned to do in my family, what I always do, just trying to do that harder or better, I'm willing to try to do something completely different. And I can remember, you know, back before I even had a counseling license or anything, I had a supervisor, and I would go in and I would talk about my you know, the work I was doing. And he would say, well, that doesn't really seem to be working very well, does it? And I would say something like, well, no, it doesn't, but I don't know what else to do. And he would always say, well, you could always stand on your chair and sing the Star Spangled Banner. And what he was trying to say to me, I have never in 25 years as a therapist ever stood on my chair inside the Star Spangled Banner, but what he was trying to say to me was, sometimes it doesn't even matter what you do different, as long as you're willing to change the dance, as long as you're willing to do something different. And then for me, the question we keep asking, so who do I want to be
Right.
in this situation gets me to the something different that I want to do.
Well, and then the final thing I would add to that is practice, practice, practice.
Man, yeah.
Again, you're the one who taught me the idea of seeing things in the rearview mirror. And so often what happens is I only recognize that I experienced chronic anxiety and I acted the way that I act, whether that's overfunctioning or conflict or whatever it is. I only recognize that after I've gotten out of a situation and gotten calmed down. And so coaching, Ken's a coach, and almost everybody who writes about family systems says that you can only learn this by having a coach. And so in the coaching experience, you begin to think about, so what pushed my buttons and what is you name it, what's the pattern? How would you like to have been different in that setting? Okay, so what would it look like for you to go back to that setting? And it may be going back to a setting where it occurs over and over, but it might be coming back to say, so Tricia, the other day we had this conversation and I got really anxious. And what I wish I had done or wish I had said is this.
Yeah. And in Faithwalking, we talk about cleaning messes up. And that's what that process is.
Right.
It's not just going back and saying, I'm sorry.
Right.
But it's going
It's
back and
practicing
having
being different.
that conversation.
Right.
Mhm.
And
Get complete.
Yeah.
practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing. I think that a part of what all of this stuff does for me is that in my original Christian formation, what I was taught was that information would change me, and so I memorized the Bible, and I come from a tradition who knows the most verses wins, and I wanted to win, so I know a lot of verses. But what was missing in that, there's nothing wrong with knowing all the verses, but what was missing in that was that nobody ever said, so if your brother offends you, then go make that right with him. They just taught me to know that verse. And so the practice, I've actually gotten fairly good at when I get offended by somebody or when somebody offends me, I've gotten pretty good at going. But where that came from was when I would get offended, I'm just going to rename it, I would get anxious, somebody helped me name it, I slowed down and was able to say, here's how I wish I had been, here's what I think Jesus teaches me to be, how I would do that, now I'm going to go back and practice that. And hardly ever do I get it right the first time, and so then I come back for some more coaching, and then I go practice again, and I come back for some more coaching, and I go practice again. And it's just that,
Right.
that behavior.
Well, to me, the image or metaphor that pops into my head is the image of enlisting a personal trainer.
Yeah.
And so the personal trainer, the first time you go in, he or she will ask you, what do you want to accomplish? And you tell them, and then he structures a set of practices for you. And you practice your way into that, and then eventually it gets easy.
Exactly.
And that's what this is. We live our way into it. We practice our way into becoming more differentiated.
But that's not what we want to do. We want to learn about it, get information about it, and go do it. And then when we can't be who we want to be, then we get guilty and ashamed, or we get blaming. Well, it's not my fault. I
This
tried,
stuff,
but they wouldn't do it.
This stuff is not
You know,
right.
I can't be who I want to be because of how they're being.
Right.
Right.
And
Or we blame this and
So that
that family
doesn't work.
system stuff, that doesn't work.
Right.
It's like the first grader who came home at the end of the first day of school and said, that school stuff stinks. I thought I was going to learn to read and I didn't learn to read today.
I think the other thing, though, that all of that kind of stirs up in me is that I've spent a lifetime becoming who I am. I'm not going to change that overnight. I'm not going to change that by reading a couple of books or talking to a couple of people or watching even a couple of videos or even going to one Faithwalking retreat. It's a lifetime of learning and growing that I take on. And yet, it's what I think Jesus called us to. He called us to be renewed in our minds.
Well, and I think I know what all three of us would give testimony to is that the persistent practice of these principles over time,
Right.
I know you're different.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you
I know
were
I'm
a mess.
But all three of us are different in ways that people who know us can see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
and our lives work better than they did
Absolutely.
before.
And what's also
Uh-huh.
true is all three of us have places that we still get anxious
Oh,
and
yeah.
don't.
Oh, yeah,
And so, I mean, it's a lifelong journey.
And that's what it is to be human, that's
Right.
okay.
Right.
right.
But there's hope in this.
Yeah, and I think part of it is to celebrate every little victory.
Mhm.
That it's why the writers of the material say just stopping and thinking is a victory.
Mhm.
Congratulate yourself for that. Don't beat yourself up for all of the mistakes and, oh, you're not doing it perfectly. Rather, congratulate yourself and celebrate all of the little changes that you're making.
So let's end this section of the video by going back to a place that we were before. You know, when you look at the life of Jesus,
Mhm.
he had, in Robert's paper, he talks about four groups of, four forces that were at work in his life trying to get him off mission, off of being who he was. The story of in the wilderness with the enemy, the story of his family coming and saying, "Come home with us." The story of Peter, his friend, saying, you're not going to go to Jerusalem and die. All the experience with the Pharisees. You look at the life of Jesus, and all four of those were forces in his life that as a human being had to make him anxious. And in spite of that anxiety, he was able to stay true to who he was and true to his mission. And that has to be a learned capacity. And what the whole idea of the differentiation of self and Robert's paper on Jesus and the differentiation of self do is they give us a kind of a frame for thinking about what does it look like for us to live in a world where chronic anxiety is always present, never going to go away, and not be defined by that.